People assume cash is useless. I think people are being foolish. The modern world has convinced itself that every single dollar must constantly be in use, that you should invest every single cent, chase every new opportunity, and let your money grow as fast as possible. This is exactly how people end up broke. Cash is not lazy, it is patient. It is the oxygen of survival. You only realize its value when it's gone. I have lived through enough financial disasters to understand one blunt truth: liquidity is life. In 1973, the market began to fall apart. Nobody wanted to buy anything. By 1974, it was a complete disaster. People who seemed like geniuses in 1968 suddenly looked incompetent. But the people who held cash, those people were not scared. They were shopping. Warren and I did not buy businesses in those years because we thought we were special. We bought because everyone else was desperate to sell, and we had the one thing they lacked: cash. Cash gives you two gifts: time and independence. Time to think clearly when others are losing their cool. Freedom to act when a chance appears disguised as a disaster. Most investors forget that. They chase high returns. They chase popular stories. They chase whatever is trendy. They forget that markets love to embarrass the overconfident. In 2008, the same story happened again. Everyone seemed smart until they suddenly weren't. Borrowed money made people rich on paper and broke in reality. The problem was never intelligence. It was the lack of a cash cushion. Even the smartest minds cannot survive when they are forced to sell. At Berkshire, we always keep billions in cash. People complained it was inefficient. They were right, inefficient during good times, but perfectly efficient during collapses. When the world was begging for money, we were sitting quietly with a checkbook. That was not luck. That was discipline. Discipline is boring, it is, but it is far better than desperation. Holding cash does not make you miss opportunities. It allows you to wait for the right ones, because most opportunities are traps disguised as activity. You cannot swing at every ball in investing. You wait for the perfect slow pitch right over the middle. And when it finally appears, you strike with force. But here is the problem. If you spend all your cash trying to look busy, you will be empty-handed when the real chance arrives. That is how most investors operate: overextended, over-indebted, and overconfident. They keep buying because they are terrified of appearing inactive. They confuse movement with progress. Stay in the game long enough and you'll realize that markets are driven by human weaknesses. Greed inflates them. Fear exposes them. Cash shields you from both. I have seen people sell their best investments just to cover short-term needs. That is not investing. That is emergency survival. And survival becomes painfully expensive when you fail to prepare. The funny thing is that holding cash is the most unpopular thing to do during a boom. Everyone makes fun of you. They insist you are missing out until the party stops. Then suddenly you are the only one with a chair. People love saying you cannot time the market, and that is true. But you can prepare for it. You do not need to predict the next crash. You only need to withstand it. Every downturn has a different cause, but the same result: overconfidence meets borrowed money, and then gravity finishes the job. So I keep cash not because I know when the storm will hit, but because I know it always will. If you think it won't, you are living in a fantasy. We have seen booms and busts since the start of capitalism. They always begin the same way: cheap money, wild excitement, and people insisting this time is different. And they always end the same way: panic, frozen money, and regret. The world never learns, and that is fortunate for those who do. If you plan to stay in this game long enough to actually win, you must treat boredom as a deliberate strategy. Cash feels dull, but dullness becomes profitable when you can outlast the restless. When the next crash arrives, and it will, you will see the same news headlines, the same panic, the same hopelessness. And you will notice the same small group of people quietly buying while everyone else is getting rid of their assets. Those individuals did not predict the downturn. They simply respected history. So when people ask me, Charlie, how much cash should I hold? I tell them, enough to sleep peacefully and enough to act when others are unable to. That is not just an idea, that is survival instinct, sharpened by decades of experience. In this world, the naive think being all in makes them brave. I believe it makes them vulnerable. Cash does not guarantee returns, it guarantees choices. And in a crisis, choices are worth a fortune. The greatest opportunities of my life appeared when others were forced to sell. And they were forced because they ignored a single rule: always hold cash for the moments when the world loses its mind. The hardest skill in investing is not deciding what to buy. It is knowing when to stay still. People are addicted to doing something. They assume any action means progress. That addiction keeps brokers wealthy. But real wealth does not come from constant movement. It comes from disciplined patience and the willingness to do absolutely nothing while everyone around you is losing their composure. You see, cash gives you that privilege. With cash, you are not forced to respond to every tiny market shift. You can sit quietly and let the reckless burn themselves out. Warren and I used to joke that our favorite investing routine was reading and waiting. No meetings, no theatrics, no forecasts, just reading and waiting. We were not idle, we were intentional. Inactivity only becomes expensive when you have no idea what you are waiting for. The typical investor buys out of boredom and sells out of fear. Both behaviors are forms of foolishness, and the market reliably punishes them with poverty. In the 1970s, I learned that most people do not lose money because of bad luck. They lose it because they cannot stand sitting still when nothing seems to be happening. They crave excitement more than results. They mistake movement for intelligence. That is why you will never hear me tell anyone to be aggressive. That is not the Berkshire way. We wait for the world to provide opportunities so obvious they seem embarrassingly simple in hindsight. And that is the part most people never understand. Doing nothing is a deliberate choice. It requires strength to hold cash and resist the temptation to force it into action. It requires humility to admit you do not have a brilliant idea every single day. People imagine the stock market is a battlefield. It is not. It is a waiting room. You are not competing against other investors. You are competing against your own impatience. That is why so few succeed. They would rather swing the bat 20 times and miss 19 than wait for one perfect pitch that changes their entire future. Patience never feels heroic. It never makes the headlines, but it quietly grows your wealth while everyone else is busy predicting the next recession, the next interest rate change, the next technological miracle. Most of those predictions are nonsense anyway. Nobody truly knows what is coming. They just cannot stand admitting it. The wisest phrase in investing is, "I don't know." It is the most truthful sentence in finance and the least appreciated. The world rewards confidence, not competence. That is why you see loud voices with no real track record giving advice on television. They sell activity because stillness does not pay their bills. But you are not in the entertainment business. You are in the business of survival and sound judgment. Cash allows you to stay rational at moments when others simply cannot afford to be. When everyone else is panicking, you have the ability to wait. When everyone else is stuck, you can act. That is the real rhythm of intelligent investing. It is not non-stop movement. It is calculated quiet. People forget that even Warren held huge amounts of cash for years when assets were ridiculously expensive. He was not trying to outsmart the market. He was merely refusing to behave foolishly. Sometimes the smartest action is complete stillness, and that is exactly what most people are incapable of. The stock market punishes ego, but eventually rewards patience. The difficulty is that eventually may take longer than your pride can tolerate. If you crave constant excitement, go to Las Vegas. If you want to build wealth, learn to appreciate boredom. When chaos appears, your instinct should be to slow down, not speed up. That is what cash gives you. The permission to pause, to let the noise fade until clarity returns. Those who destroy their finances in downturns always share one flaw. They could not stop. They traded too much, borrowed too much, and overestimated themselves. And when the tide pulled back, they discovered what Warren always joked about, who had been swimming without clothes. Cash is your swimsuit. It protects you when the world suddenly empties the pool. So when people brag about being fully invested, I simply smile. They think it shows courage. I think it shows fragility because I already know what comes next. The market gives you a handful of quiet years to accumulate cash, then one vicious year to prove whether you actually did. Most people never learn because those calm years trick them into overconfidence. They start believing downturns are things of the past until the next one shows up right on schedule. And when it does, the only survivors are the ones who could afford to do nothing while everyone else was desperately doing everything. That is the contradiction of investing. The less you move, the more choices you keep. And the more choices you keep, the less you lose when things fall apart. So yes, keep cash, but even more importantly, keep patience. Because without patience, your cash will not remain yours for long. Remember, survival in markets is not about being brilliant. It is about endurance. And endurance begins with knowing when to sit still and stay quiet. Most people picture cash as a shield. I view it as a weapon. Not a weapon for gambling, but for seizing opportunity. In the hands of someone rational, cash becomes strength. In the hands of someone emotional, it becomes paper waiting to disappear. Let me share something I have learned after nearly a full century of watching markets rise and crumble. When fear fills the system, cash becomes king. In those moments, valuations don't matter. Liquidity is everything. The person who has liquidity sets the terms. The person who doesn't is left praying someone answers the phone. I have watched this happen over and over again. In 1973, people convinced themselves that stocks would rise forever. They borrowed aggressively, bought bad investments, and congratulated themselves for being smart. Then the recession hit, forced sales arrived, and their smart holdings were sold at extremely low prices. Meanwhile, we were quietly holding cash, not because we foresaw the crash, no one can do that, but because we respected how quickly foolishness can spread. When you stay liquid, you do not need to predict the future. You just need to survive whatever it brings. That is the difference between the rational and the reckless. Rational people accept that the future is unpredictable. Reckless people think unpredictability is a stage to show off confidence. Cash gives you humility. It reminds you that even a wonderful business can stumble, that even a brilliant investor can look foolish temporarily, and that is perfectly acceptable because you cannot go broke by being patient. You can, however, go broke by being too efficient. People love to optimize. They want every dollar invested, every penny earning interest. They cannot stand the sight of a pile of cash doing nothing. But here is the irony, that idle pile becomes priceless when the world falls apart. The beauty of cash is that it demands nothing from you. It does not need luck. It does not need performance. It simply waits until you finally need it. It does not care about inflation chatter or the Federal Reserve's announcements. It simply waits. And when opportunity finally shows up, cash does not ask for permission. It moves immediately. In 1999, people believed the internet would make everyone wealthy. We did not know which companies would ultimately survive, but we knew the frenzy would eventually break. So we waited. When the crash came, we were not mourning losses, we were shopping again. The cycle repeats endlessly. Boom, euphoria, carelessness, collapse. And in every cycle, the winners are never the ones calling the top. They are the ones holding cash when the bottom arrives. It is not glamorous, it is not thrilling, but it works. The rational investor treats cash like a loaded tool, kept quiet, secured, but ready, not something to show off for attention, but something to use when opportunity is within reach. The emotional investor, however, treats cash like a curse. He cannot stand to keep it. It feels like it burns a hole in his pocket. He keeps asking, what should I do with it? And the answer is sometimes nothing. Sometimes the most intelligent move is to choose not to move. You do not need brilliance to build wealth. You simply need to avoid foolishness long enough for opportunity to reach your doorstep. Cash enables that. Investing is not about timing the market. It is about remaining in the game until the odds finally lean your way. And they always do eventually, but only if you are still financially sound when they do. Most people fail before that moment arrives. They overextend themselves, trade constantly, and overestimate their emotional strength. They forget that in investing, borrowed money and ego are twin explosives. Cash is your safety pin. It lets you step back from the chaos to observe clearly while others are blinded by greed. It grants you the freedom to wait for sanity to return. And when it does, you are not begging for mercy. You are writing checks. That is what rationality looks like in practice. Not flashy trades or complicated words, just the steady confidence of someone who can afford to wait. People often ask, Charlie, is holding cash not wasteful when inflation eats at it? I tell them losing 2% a year to inflation is minor compared to losing 50% overnight to stupidity. Inflation may nibble at your capital. Panic will devour it whole. That is the choice the rational understand. We would rather look foolish holding cash than be destroyed chasing returns. When everyone else is shouting buy the dip, we are leaning back with our feet up, waiting for the shouting to stop. Because once the noise fades, value becomes clear, and the only people capable of hearing it are those who did not drown in debt. So yes, cash is a weapon, but only for those who can discipline themselves. Otherwise, it is just ammunition wasted on poor decisions. Remember, markets do not reward cleverness. They reward self-control, and cash is self-control in its most concentrated form. Use it carefully, and the chaos of the world turns into your opportunity. Every downturn I have lived through begins with the same problem: overinvestment. It starts quietly, disguised as confidence. Then it swells into arrogance and finishes in tears. People cannot stand idle money. They treat cash like it is poisonous. So they put every dollar to work, even the ones they might desperately need tomorrow. Then the storm arrives, and suddenly fully invested becomes fully trapped. They do not sell because they choose to. They sell because circumstances force them to. And there is a massive difference between the two. I have watched billionaires make that exact mistake. Brilliant minds ruined by a lack of available cash. They owned excellent assets, just not the right degree of flexibility. The issue is not bad investments, it is fragile positioning. You can survive a poor decision or two. You cannot survive being forced to sell at the wrong moment. In 1998, a fund called Long-Term Capital Management collapsed. It was run by men who had won Nobel Prizes in economics. They used models, borrowed heavily, and had confidence in equal amounts. They made enormous fortunes until the day they didn't. When market swings returned, their models failed. They owed more than they could possibly repay. The same minds that once boasted about eliminating risk ended up begging for rescue. That is the price for overinvestment. You stop managing risk and start believing you are superior to it. At Berkshire, we never tricked ourselves that way. We always held cash not because it produced high returns, but because it kept us breathing. People forget that being overinvested is simply a quiet form of debt. You become indebted to the market's stability, and the market almost never pays on time. Without a cash buffer, even a tiny shock feels like an earthquake. A late payment, a rate hike, a rumor. Suddenly your entire structure trembles because it was built on borrowed money and optimism instead of discipline. I have watched CEOs running very lean companies lose their businesses overnight. They told themselves, we're efficient. What they actually meant was, we're exposed. Efficiency sounds clever. Resilience sounds dull, but resilience is what keeps you alive. The truth is, you earn no extra points for being fully invested. You simply take on extra risk. The market does not care how smart you appear when everything rises. It cares how financially sound you remain when everything falls. That is when you discover who prepared for winter and who worshipped an eternal summer. People like to insist, you cannot just sit in cash, Charlie. Of course you can. I have done it many times. It is not glamorous, but it beats sitting in fear. Overinvesting is like overeating. It feels satisfying until it doesn't. You won't notice the damage until it becomes permanent. And by then you are always forced into a selling spree, I remember during the 2008 crisis, companies that boasted about maximizing shareholder value were suddenly begging for mercy. They had poured every spare dollar into buying back their own stock instead of keeping reserves. When the music stopped, they had no chair. Meanwhile, we were buying high-quality businesses at half price. Not because we were geniuses, but because we're not foolish. That is a hugely underestimated advantage in life, avoiding stupidity. You don't need brilliance if you can simply avoid the disasters everyone else lines up for. Overinvestment is one of those disasters. It tempts you during the good times, flatters your ego, and punishes you brutally when the situation changes. That is why I always say you don't need to swing at every pitch. You don't even need to play every inning. You only need to remain standing when everyone else has left the field. That is the quiet power of cash. It gives you time, choices, and peace of mind. Overinvestment destroys all three. The world keeps preaching that you must be fully invested. It sounds bold, looks confident, but it is just another form of dependency. You have chained yourself to the market's emotional cycles. A rational investor does not want dependency. He wants flexibility. That is why at Berkshire we hold cash like a fire extinguisher. You don't keep one because you expect fires every day. You keep it because when the fire arrives, and it always does, you will not have time to buy one. So when I hear people boast about being all in, I see a ticking clock. They are praying for perfect weather in a world built on storms. And hope is not a strategy. It is a symptom of denial. The cost of overinvestment is not only financial, it is emotional. You cannot think clearly when you have borrowed too much. You cannot wait patiently when you need the market to behave. Cash buys clarity, overinvestment buys anxiety, and anxiety mixed with investing leads straight to disaster. So if you ever feel uneasy holding cash, remind yourself of this. You are not wasting opportunity, you are buying independence. And independence is what saves you when others collapse under their own overconfidence. You never truly discover who you are as an investor until your portfolio falls by 50%. Everyone sounds rational when prices rise. Everyone preaches patience during good markets, but when fear sweeps through the system, logic collapses faster than values. Crashes do not only test your portfolio, they test your character. That is when you learn whether your long-term conviction was actual discipline or merely borrowed confidence. I have seen both. In 1974, most investors were not destroyed by the market itself. They were ruined by their own behavior, by panic, by borrowed money, and by the inability to sit still. They sold not because circumstances forced them to, but because they could not tolerate the pain of watching their losses grow. They wanted control in a moment where no control existed. That is what fear does. It turns smart people foolish and turns disciplined people reckless. The only remedy I have ever found is cash, not because cash makes you wealthy, but because it keeps you steady. When you hold cash, you do not feel trapped. You can think clearly, and clear thinking during turmoil is the rarest luxury in the world. People imagine that wealth is about squeezing out maximum returns. It is not. It is about minimizing regret. After you witness enough market cycles, you learn that crashes themselves do not destroy most people. Their reactions do. The truth is that fear spreads faster than any disease. One headline, one rumor, one bankruptcy, and the crowd completely loses its mind. You cannot prevent the market from falling, but you can prevent yourself from falling with it. And that is where character steps in. Character means staying seated through chaos without trembling. It means watching opportunity rise from the wreckage instead of running away from it. In every market collapse, there are two types of individuals: the forced sellers and the patient buyers. The forced sellers believed risk had disappeared forever. The patient buyers understood risk never leaves. Guess which group walks away owning the assets once the dust finally settles? Warren and I never enjoyed market crashes, but we respected them. They cleanse the system. They remind people of essential truths. They reward discipline and punish delusion. When others saw apocalypse, We saw clearance racks. In 2008, the story repeated itself. People who were boasting about using borrowed money only months earlier were suddenly on TV begging for money and blaming unprecedented conditions. But nothing was unprecedented, only ignored. Every crisis feels new because memory fades and ego swells. That is why we relearn the same rules over and over. Do not borrow to invest. Do not overpay for promises, and always, always keep cash. When people ask me how to prepare for a crash, they expect a complicated manual. I tell them if you need complexity to feel safe, you are already in danger. Preparation is not a spreadsheet, it is a mindset. You cannot buy good temperament. You build it through humility and through experience. And nothing teaches humility faster than watching the market completely disregard your brilliance. During the dot-com craze, everyone believed they were a visionary. By 2001, half of them were searching for jobs. Same individuals, different price tags. That is how markets teach character. They strip away fantasies. They reveal who has been thinking and who has merely been hoping. Hope is not a strategy, it is emotional pain relief. When the crash arrives, hope vanishes instantly. All that remains is what you actually did before the chaos, how much you saved, how much you borrowed, how much you can withstand. That is character. And character reveals itself through cash reserves, careful choices, and the willingness to act while everyone else freezes. In the height of panic, when the crowd is getting rid of everything that is not bolted down, cash gives you a quiet smile because you are not watching your world collapse. You are watching prices you once considered impossible turn irresistible. That is not luck. That is the payoff for years of restraint. When fear rules the market, rationality becomes the rarest asset, and those who possess rationality along with real cash get to buy the future at a discount. Crashes do not create wealth. They uncover who is worthy of it. So the next time the market is booming and everyone looks invincible, remember this. The real test is not how much you earn when times are easy. It is how little you lose and how composed you remain when everything catches fire. Because in every financial crisis, wealth does not vanish. It merely changes owners, moving from the emotional to the rational. I have spent my entire life trying to stay on the rational side of that exchange. You ought to do the same. Everyone says patience is a good quality, but very few understand how difficult it feels while you're practicing it. In investing, patience is anything but passive. It is painful. It means holding cash while others brag about their gains. It means waiting quietly while the market rewards noisy people. It means being laughed at for doing nothing right up until the moment you are proven correct. And even then, no one claps. They stay silent because the world doesn't celebrate the person who waits. It only notices the person who moves. But let me share something I have learned after nearly a full century of observing human behavior. The impatient often appear clever in the short term, but it is the patient who quietly win in the long term. The world will constantly try to tempt you into action. There is always some new product, some new industry, some fresh next big thing. People hate the idea of staying still while others seem to surge ahead. So they chase, they trade, they react wildly, and they convince themselves this is strategy. Meanwhile, the patient investor simply watches. He is not idle. He is waiting for reality to match true value. That is what patience truly means, the discipline to wait for the world to regain sanity. At Berkshire, we were patient because we had no other choice. We refused to buy foolishness even when foolishness was popular. During the technology bubble, people called us dinosaurs. They said we didn't understand, and they were right. We did not understand why anyone would pay endless amounts for companies with no profits. And because we didn't understand, we also didn't get wiped out when the whole thing collapsed. That is the price of patience, temporary embarrassment. You will look foolish today so that you can look brilliant tomorrow. But most people cannot handle that trade-off. They want to appear smart immediately. They would rather lose money with the crowd than look wrong standing alone. That is not investing, that is social survival. And social survival drains fortunes. Patience does not only protect your capital, it protects your mental state, because when you are patient, you stop reacting to every bit of noise. You observe from a position of strength. You can afford to wait because you prepared for waiting. You held cash when it felt uncomfortable. You stayed conservative while the world was excited. That is not luck, that is resilience. And resilience is the most underrated advantage in investing. The market will always test your patience long before it rewards it. That is how it separates gamblers from adults. Patience sounds simple when described aloud. But when prices are soaring and your friends are doubling their accounts, you inevitably question whether you are the one missing out. I have felt that pressure too, in the 1950s and the 1970s and the 1990s. Every era has its illusions. You never outgrow temptation, you merely improve at ignoring it. The key is to remember that bubbles do not announce their arrival. They just expand until they no longer can. And when they burst, everyone pretends they knew it all along. Patience is simply the art of not needing that comfort. You do not need to be right in public. You only need to be right eventually. Cash is what makes that possible. It gives you the ability to be patient without being forced into reckless action. It lets you wait for clarity while others drown in confusion. The impatient claim that time is money. The patient understand that time is leverage. The longer you can wait without losing your nerve, the more the world tilts in your favor. When people ask, how long should I hold cash? I tell them, until stupidity gets cheaper. It always does. The market is a machine that converts optimism into opportunity for those who wait. If you can endure boredom, you will eventually own assets that others dumped in panic. If you cannot, you will end up owning regret instead. Nearly all great fortunes were built slowly and quietly. Nobody tweets about the years of inactivity, the decades of compounding, the countless decisions not made yet. Those are the actual ingredients of wealth. Real patience builds empires. And here is the great irony. When patience finally pays off, it looks like luck. People will say, you timed the market perfectly. They will miss the entire point. You didn't time anything. You simply waited while they rushed. And when the dust settled, your boring discipline looked like brilliance. So yes, patience costs you comfort, reputation, and sometimes pride. But it rewards you with peace, longevity, and survival. And in investing, those rewards are worth more than any short-term applause. Those are the only forms of currency that truly matter. You can always sense when a market is nearing collapse, not by looking at spreadsheets, but by observing people. When everyone is boasting, when your barber suddenly becomes a stock expert, when easy money becomes a common topic at dinner, that is not prosperity. That is an alarm bell. People fail to notice it because greed pretends to be optimism. It feels intelligent, it feels earned, but make no mistake, greed always hides weakness. I have witnessed it more times than I can count. The late 1960s, the late 1990s, 2006, 2007, different bubbles, identical psychology. The participants change, but the fantasy remains. This time is different. That is the costliest sentence in human history. When the crowd becomes greedy, your job is not to follow them. Your job is to hold your fire. Protect your cash, protect your clarity, and let gravity do its job, because it always does, always. You do not need to predict the exact day of the fall. You only need to be prepared when it arrives. Warren and I made more money by doing absolutely nothing during periods of euphoria than we ever made by trading frantically. We simply sat there, calm, bored, unimpressed, while others inflated each other's confidence. It is not that we enjoyed missing out. We simply understood the math of madness. When prices disconnect from reality, they do not correct, they implode. And when they do, all the people who believed they were geniuses suddenly discover they were merely lucky. That is why we kept cash and refused to buy even when critics called us timid or outdated. They laughed while we sat on billions in cash. They stopped laughing when their portfolios were sliced in half. I have said it before, it is not supposed to be easy. If it were, everyone would be wealthy. But the truth is, most people cannot handle prosperity. It makes them reckless. It turns discipline into overconfidence. Greed blinds you to danger because it feels so good to be right, and that is exactly how it traps you.